If you're vulnerable to psychic damage from roguish language, stay away from these gibbering mouths. But if you intend on listening to this podcast about enriching your fantastical group hallucinations, you're too far gone already.
Your next game is going to be collaboratively detailed, and here's why. In this episode, we find some answers to how can we get players hooked on the game world right away,
and what quick details help culture pop at the table.
And how awesome is the Quantum Kickflip podcast?
It's super awesome, but we'll get to that. Welcome to the Hook and Chance podcast. I'm Travis.
And I'm his brother Jordan. Our topic today is a pretty universal topic. It's something that I think we're all constantly trying to improve upon.
Session zeros?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And getting people into it with that session zero.
This is one of those things that I always go like, nah, I know my players well enough. We've been playing for a long time. I can probably skip it. And I pay for it literally every time.
Yeah. I find when your session zero doesn't get things off to that right start, then you're sitting there, connections between the characters can feel forced. The players might not be invested in the way that, those great games you've felt before, but things just aren't coming together right.
Yeah, and, to be honest, what I struggle with the most is getting my players invested in the world. Investment and immersion are a thing that has to be done more naturally than I typically do, because like most DMs, I feel like I come up with this world and then I go, whoa, guys, do you love this? And they go, yeah, it's kind of neat. That's, I didn't catch most of what you just said, but I get the vibe that you're going for. So that's kind of cool.
Sure, let's try it. But you don't understand the depth and the nuance that I've come up with. It's amazing.
Well, there's a lot of things that we can do to try to avoid some of these pitfalls, but I wouldn't say that we're experts in this space.
Someday, perchance.
But why not get an expert?
Yeah.
So our guest today is David Ray, a wildly talented performer who regularly creates all kinds of entertainment.
Who's previously been a part of Yeg D&D, a high fantasy improv show based on Dungeons & Dragons.
He's a co-creator of the Prairie Improv Federation, a WWE-inspired improv performer showdown.
He's done all kinds of additional shows, contributing in a pretty big way to Edmonton's local comedy world. Also, being a part of the Debutantes, a sketch comedy troupe based in that same city.
And they have started up a tabletop role-playing actual play podcast called Quantum Kickflip, where they play a game called Slug Blaster.
He's also deeply experienced at running games in his personal life, all enhanced by his experience in the worlds of writing and performing in great stories with great characters.
So for today, he's bringing that wonderful collection of experiences to us. We're going to talk very quickly about designing cultures with character input, and also just generally have a really extensive and interesting conversation about how to build a bigger, broader world that doesn't lose players, but instead gets them invested in everything that you've collectively created. So this is all about getting players on the same page by building the world with them.
And with that, welcome, David.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. I mean, we've met before many moons ago, but it's great to have you back and to be able to talk about all the things that you are incredibly good at. You've got a really wide berth of skills and experiences. So we're gonna mine those. We're gonna juice them, whatever.
Just extract all of that.
Leave me a husk. Mine them.
Yes. Just leave me a husk of a person. That's fine. That's fine.
And it worked.
Yeah, precisely.
But the last time we chatted, you did have a lot of pretty wild creative ideas going on, and I'm assuming that's still the case. So what has been swirling around in your mind today? What creative project is at the forefront?
I suppose there's two currently. One is Quantum Kickflip, which I will talk a little bit later. But also, actually, in the next week or so, we are going to be shooting a movie, The Debutantes, the people behind Quantum Kickflip. We're working on a Christmas movie.
Oh, boy.
like an anti-Christmas movie, sort of, with like horror elements. It's going to be called The Spirit of Christmas. It's so you can use that
Yeah.
and go with it. Yeah. So it's
We're
going to be a
right
lot of
along
fun.
there with you.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So it's like the end of October. So we're doing all the interior shots and doing all that kind of stuff. And it's going to be fun. I'm looking forward to it.
Right on. That sounds awesome. You'll have to let us know how that turns out.
I don't know what I'm allowed to talk about, with that, because it's not, and I'm just a cog in the wheel. You know what I mean? I'm just I helped write it, and I'm appearing in it, but I don't make any decisions. So
all of the work that the debutantes do is just so, it sits in this bizarre crossroads of thoughtful, zany, and just flat out hilarious. Like you guys have this vibe to you. So I cannot wait to see what a Christmas movie, horror Christmas movie looks like.
It's weird to describe without giving away too much of it. But yeah, I do like to think that the debutantes have a lot of heart in their work, that yes, we try to be funny, but also we try to do the thing where it's like, yay, we have an opportunity to say something, to speak into, what life is like. And we try to honor that while still, making as many dick jokes as you can. You know what I mean? You gotta find the balance in life.
You can't lose the core of what you do.
We are in comedy,
Yeah. Well, we can't wait to dive in more. We're going to talk more about your podcast and just some of the work that you got going on. But first, like we said, we're going to strip mine all of those brilliant ideas. And we're going to do that all focused around culture creation and your particular method of kicking off an RPG. So let's do that in our Strategy Stateroom.
This is the Strategy Stateroom, where inventive and cunning tactics are crafted for when they're needed most.
Okay, so when we first talked to David about his method and kind of some of the things that we do as well, we found that it boiled down to what you do in your session 0 to start things off. And we came up with 3 phases that this all kind of falls into, that you can run through in your session 0 and come out with a great place to start your game. So the first phase is foundation. The second is collaborative world building. And the third is character creation.
So let's start at the foundation phase. I think this one, and fill us in on how you typically go about doing this as well. But I know that, having recently run through a brand new session 0, it's kind of funny when you do 2-year-long, 3-year-long campaigns, you don't get an opportunity to do another session 0 for sometimes years at a time. So having done this recently myself, I'm really excited to talk about this topic in particular because it's fairly fresh. But with foundation, I know that this is pretty common practice, is just going through that whole list of what are the really important ground rules to lay down.
Yeah.
Do you have anything that you kind of cover in your kind of foundation phase?
I think when it comes to starting off and you're setting the tone of the campaign, it's important to get on board with what the players want. It's a collaborative game. It's not just the Dungeon Master's game. So what I'll often do at the start of a new one, I have my new group of players, or it's, the same old players coming together to do a new game. I come with a few pitches for them. I come with, things that I think would be interesting to do. And I'll throw, kind of give a summarized version of it. Maybe I'll say, so here are some ideas I have. I was thinking maybe we could do one that's like a Pride and Prejudice style game where, it's about high society and different, about that high end of society and how that all works. Or maybe, do you want to do a pirate game with airships and all that kind of stuff? Or do you want to be part of a pioneer town in the Shadowfell? And I'll give them the different options I have. I'll even take in people's ideas if they happen to have one, and then we kind of put it to a vote. In some places, when I have like a lot of players, like say if I have like 8 to 10 and I'm going to run 2 separate campaigns, it will also help me filter out which players I'm going to put into which campaigns. And I put it to a vote because I have enough ideas that, if I can get behind any one of these, then great. That you want your players to be on board with whatever the campaign is.
So you're one of those hard-working DMs that's got like 3 games on the go.
So I just 2.
Oh,
Fortunately for me, they're both in the same world, so it's a lot easier to kind of like maintain like, oh, this is what this world is like. So it's a little bit easier.
yeah, that makes a huge difference. I'm assuming when you bring that to the table too, though, you're bringing it to the group so that they can tweak those original ideas with their input.
Yeah, well, and especially as once it's chosen, then we can kind of talk a little bit about it, and you'll see that in like as we go through these phases how that may look like. But at the start, it's just like, here is the essential idea. Are we playing a hoity-toity Pride and Prejudice, or are we like doing some sort of like John Wick revenge plot? Whatever the thing is, let's get on board with that vibe first.
Or a Christmas horror, even perhaps.
Perhaps you could totally do that. Make Santa like some giant monster.
I mean,
Futurama did this famously.
Yeah, that's true.
I'm thinking a challenge rating of 21, and you got to work your way through every one of his reindeer before you can finally face him.
And of course, he can summon any kind of item to his hand, right? Because he has elves making them, right?
So many toys.
The entire Dungeon Master's guide full of items. I like it.
Well, I think if you're listening to this, and for the purposes of a session 0, it should probably be mentioned that there's also, kind of all of what I like to start with first anyways is more or less just the table rule. So how does leveling up work? Does everyone want to do XP, or do they want to do, milestone leveling? That's sometimes a DM preference. Sometimes players don't really care. Sometimes they have really strong feelings about it. I know that with behavior and expectations, this was something that our dad, since he does a lot of classroom teaching, one of the things that I took away from a lot of his classes is he would always start with something like this. He would do a session 0 in class, in that he would get everyone in class to kind of come to some term of agreement in the very beginning to say, hey, how late is okay? If you're going to be late to class, if you're going to miss class, if you're going to, and that's what we do with these session 0s as well, is we get everyone on board for, behavior and expectations, how to handle those absences, or even like ethics and topics to avoid for the comfort of everyone at the table.
Expectations are, I think, fundamental. I think that's why it's good to put up front, because if people are thinking that a game is going to go a certain way and it goes this way, that's when they start, not having a good time. If they are wanting like a very crunchy kind of game with about precise rules and precise numbers and like following the rules hardcore, that's important to know at the beginning, right? Versus if you have a group that just like, hey, it's okay if we just kind of like focus on the role playing or whatever the thing is. And of course, that's where even that whole lines and veils the idea of like what topics are okay to talk about with or explore in the campaign. If you find out that, hey, maybe we shouldn't deal with this topic because this would upset a person, that's not going to be fun when you bring it up and you didn't have that discussion beforehand. You got to make sure people are on board so that everybody can have fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think with, like you said, lines and veils, what's so beautiful about this game is that you can just have ridiculous, balls to the wall, weird ass fun, or you can actually play stuff that explores some challenging topics, gives you some catharsis. But like you said, everyone has to know that they're all playing the same game at the outset, because that's a harsh reality that they're about to face in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, if people are coming into it and they're like, oh, this is going to be like Adventure Time, and then it's just Game of Thrones, it might be it might be heartbreaking to somebody and just like a little bit too bleak, because this is ultimately escapist fantasy for some, and maybe the grim, dark version of a game is not going to be what they want. Some people want Ted Lasso. Some people want Squid Game.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
and this gives everyone the opportunity to either come to that agreement or to simply bow out. And going back to the example of our dad teaching a class, some people would simply say, you know what? 90% of people have this expectations in this classroom. This is not an expectation I feel comfortable trying to fulfill. I'm going to bow out and I'm going to stop right now. And that's totally valid and that's totally fair. But that's where every player gets to kind of get on board. And they also tend to police themselves. I find that really valuable too, is that when everyone at the table, not just the DM, has to try to bring the banhammer down to say, hey, you know what? You've missed 3 or 4 games in a row. We kind of agreed that 1 or 2 at the most was acceptable. Now all of a sudden the players are policing each other instead of the DM always having to be the bad guy and have those tough conversations.
Because if the DM is deciding like, oh, they've missed so many, and it would seem appropriate, even if the rest of the party kind of agrees. If it hadn't been discussed before, it does feel like the dungeon master is just arbitrarily making up some sort of expectation that was not actually established. So yeah, it is important to go over, what is acceptable for absences, what is okay, what are topics that are not okay to talk about or broach, and even the kind of house rules you may have you're going to follow, you're going to add these things, or you're not going to have access to these races or classes or whatever. It's good to have all that in that initial discussion. And this is why session 0 is so important.
And what I love is that the internet is full of lists of a lot of these topics about what you should probably cover in a session 0. Like there's dozens out there. They're all tremendous. The one bit that I know that we had discussed and we had kind of chatted about, and all of us, I think, were really on board for, that I don't see mentioned a lot, is talking about 3 major pieces that I think is really kind of core to that foundation. One is the theme, one is the influences, and then one is kind of that era and that vibe that you touched on with, talking about, oh yeah, we're going to do Pride and Prejudice. So with theme, what kind of themes are you finding the most fun to play with in D&D right now?
I think a lot of it ties back to like morality and, what is good and evil. It's very easy to go into the Star Wars, the Emperor's clearly evil and, Yoda's clearly good. And that's all fine. But sometimes it's muddied by things, and where does redemption lie in that? And so those are that's the kind of themes I like to explore in it. The other kind of thing that I like to have is mystery, some sort of grand mystery. I'm a fan of Lost, including season 6, which I know is super unpopular, but I do like the idea of a grand mystery, and I'll have that throughout my campaign. But those are the broad kind of themes that if a player's coming to my table, you can kind of expect those kind of things in my campaign.
Do you put any of that out there when you start? Like, do you give that expectation?
I suppose, maybe I'll talk about the mystery thing. There's going to be some things that are going to be slowly revealed. But I don't necessarily talk about this is the ideas that we're going to explore. I just let them happen and let them react to it. I think you can sometimes, especially if you're going to go with a certain kind of theme, like if you're setting out one survival, for instance, that affects your gameplay to a very distinct amount, where it's just in a survival thing, suddenly keeping track of encumbrance might make a lot of difference. Maybe you're going to have to keep track of rations, for instance. And so in my campaign, the things that we're doing, I am actually running a Pride and Prejudice game right now. I don't care about rations or money even. I don't even keep track of money. You probably could afford it. I don't want to bother with all of that. So let's just focus on the story and your decisions and stuff like that.
100%. What what I found recently with doing this session 0 with my players is that we did kind of spitball some themes early on. And like you said, it completely affects how you want the game to play. You choose later on to throw a dragon into the game. But is this dragon, is it going to be more about survival? Is it going to be a force of nature? Or if you didn't come up with that theme, is it going to be more about greed? And so now the dragon has a very different tone, and how you use it in your game is totally different. So like a good example that I was just thinking of before we hopped in here is when you are able to throw out themes that don't seem to have a ton of through lines, maybe. Like one example is if you take that survival theme, add corporate greed, and then motherhood as a theme, you've got Alien. Like those were all core themes of Alien, but you've got a very interesting kind of pitch for a game when you smash all those themes together.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I really like that. That's good.
And what I found with the players is at least getting them on board meant that they were all completely stoked for the themes that we chose.
When they feel like they're a part of the process, when they feel like they actually helped to define the game that they're going to play.
Yeah, because it will also affect how they make their characters. Hopefully, they'll kind of align what they make according to those ideas, right? Which is good when you're putting out themes or whatever and discussing that with your players. Sometimes, you may want to just choose a theme and you're going to present it, but like if you're pretty open-ended to what kind of campaign, because I know some people are just like, I don't know what to do. Which I can completely understand too. Talk with your players, which I think you'll see as a theme going throughout the rest of this episode, is if you don't know, ask your players. They will help you.
And sometimes, even taking it a step further and saying, whatever thought or idea that you have, sometimes it's better to let it go and let the players come up with it. Because I know that I've done this in the past. I made a lot of mistakes as a DM. I've come up with a whole theme and a story and a world, and I've come to the table and said, you guys, I've got it. This is so good. You're going to love it. Turns out they're not going to love it because they didn't help build it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
The next one is influences. And like in this last bout of a session 0, I just had the players come up with 1 to 3 major influences. And like we just kind of discussed, if you choose Game of Thrones, that's got a vibe, that's got a tone versus like Lord of the Rings.
Or Adventure Time. And those are all set in the same kind of setting, technically, kind of.
Yeah, absolutely. and even if you compare other like actual play ones where Dimension 20 is kind of like Critical Role, but they play fundamentally different too. Like, and they're both valid ways of playing, but what do your players want? And, I play with comedians and improvisers. So no matter how we can have like moments of seriousness, but generally you are going to have a lot of comedy regardless. And I just accept that, and that's fine. But because I'm willing to go with it and play with it, because there used to be a time in my life where I'm like, well, it's got to be somehow realistic. We're doing kind of a Lord of the Rings, and you are going to be supremely disappointed if you try to force a whole group of adults do the same thing that you want. You got to kind of find compromise in all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I really love about the influences piece is that it goes beyond just the setting. If I were to say Game of Thrones, sure, there's almost some different influences that you can even pick out of there. Is it the political intrigue? Is it the massive scale battles? Is it being a powerful badass and being able to ride a dragon? Like whatever that influence is, you get a lot from just kind of throwing things together. If you were to take, say, those themes of survival, corporate greed, and motherhood that made up Alien, and then throw in an influence like the movie Speed, now all of a sudden it's totally different, right? So like you're like, okay, so it's got to be frenetic and it's got to be alive, and you got to feel pressure all the time. Okay, that took on a totally different tone.
Yeah, like for instance, if you took you could do sort of survival, corporate greed, and motherhood, put it through the lens of Fury Road. That would also technically work, but that's a vitally different game.
But all of these really help to try to establish. And then, of course, you've got that era piece. And I think when we're talking about fantasy games, you have to use era really loosely.
Yeah, for sure.
It's like, I
Yes.
want Westerns with dinosaurs and like all kinds of weird shit.
Yes.
But, you know, like you said, you've got a Pride and Prejudice game. Like that puts me, as soon as you say that, I know what era, I know what time it is.
You kind of have a visual of like what the clothes might be like, what the music might be like. And yeah, you can tweak all of those things. And there could be, you know, maybe gnomish airships also present in this world. However, it's broadly informed by this major set piece or the major era kind of thing. And you can go from there and tweak everything.
Yeah.
Like even the idea of like what your classes look like. Pride and Prejudice fighter looks much different than, say, a medieval crusader type campaign, you know, but they all can work. But an era kind of gives you that starting point.
Absolutely. And then even to build on that a little bit further, even if you say, you know, you've got your influence of Pride and Prejudice, that's your influence, but we're going to do modern and there's going to be automatic weapons. And like, okay, I've got the influence of Pride and Prejudice in that era, but now I've got, you know, we're doing it modern era. So, you know, all of those different pieces kind of come together to make and flesh out that whole thing to get the players on board as well as the DM.
Yeah, it's just like the same way if you can take your influences to be like William Shakespeare, but the era is modern. And then suddenly you have Leonardo DiCaprio with a gun that's labeled as a longsword, but that can still work. It still had the vibe of, you know, what this kind of Shakespearean story was in a different context. And yeah, if everybody's playing that way, then you can kind of like unify the group. And by having that discussion, it helps guard against players playing two different games.
Yeah, that's a huge benefit of this kind of approach because it's so hard to rein that back in once those two players start moving opposite directions.
As soon as you have two players at the table, one who has made Princess Sparkle and one who has made a basic Grim Reaper character that is nigh invincible and extremely gritty all the time, like you said, Jared, you can't rein that back in. The genie cannot be put back into the bottle once that happens.
Yeah, well, and I think this is a good point to put out to your players before coming to session 0. You know, feel free to have some ideas for characters, but hold on just a second. You know, wait till we're there. Let's talk together because maybe the era and the influences and the themes don't really match up with your character, but maybe it'll inspire you to do something else and you get really excited about that. So that I try to tell my players, I mean, players will often have their set ideas and I'm like, I'm gonna play Neo no matter what. I don't care. And all right, well, you know that there's no internet in the Crusades, right? Yeah. Okay.
You know they didn't wear trench coats. No one else is wearing a trench coat.
They don't have the ability to have like seams like they do. You know, like you're far way away. Yeah.
But what I still love about that is that through that lens now, because we've done that foundational bit, I can now imagine what, you know, very similar Leo DiCaprio, modern Shakespeare. I can put those pieces together and start to tweak. And we end up with something that's a lot more interesting, I think, to everyone, because not only are the players surprised, but the DM is as well. And I found that I was a lot more on board. The ideas were just coming like crazy for this newest campaign because I did this foundational piece. And I think the part that made me so happy was when one of my players said, as a result of doing some of this world building and some of this foundational stuff, said, is this going to be a movie anytime soon? Like they were completely invested in the idea that they had come up with.
It gets them really excited.
Yeah.
For sure.
On that note, we should move on to phase 2, which is collaborative world building. And I know that you have a lot of interesting ideas when it comes to how to build a world.
Yeah. One of my weaknesses as a dungeon master has been world building and coming up with cultures, because if I don't sit down and do it, I'm just going like, well, I guess it's Lord of the Rings. Orcs are like this, elves are like this, dwarves are like this. And it's, and that's fine, but it also doesn't feel like it's your world fully. And not that you have to rewrite everything and sit down and come up with everything in a world. That's a lot because you are also one person with a limited amount of time. So in the same way, I came up with this kind of shortcut method of coming up with the culture. And I incorporate it into my own session 0 so that the players can, cooperate and collaborate with this. And the thing that I like about this is that because they are making the culture, they are invested and they're more likely to choose one of these things. So how I start with it is, I'll come up with a broad map, maybe like what would be maybe your standard place, your like what everybody is imagining a medieval land to look like, whatever. And, 2 or 3 biomes that are nearby. And then for each one of those biomes, I go ahead and make a culture with the players that we're going to kind of go through on this. I start with like choosing one of the biomes. For instance, maybe it's like this jungle swamp-like area. And I'll say that, the most dominant races here are like orcs and goblins and stuff like that, just to kind of like, okay, this is where we're beginning. And I ask 3 main questions. And after every one of these main questions, I kind of like fill in details. I ask for my players to help fill this out. So, if I'm going with this jungle swamp area with orcs and goblins, I'll begin with take like the orcs. What is kind of unique about them? What do people outside of the culture know about these orcs? And I encourage them to not just do what stereotypical orcs that we all know. Like try to not think of Lord of the Rings. Try to make something special about them.
They're libraries.
Yeah, maybe they're librarians. They actually have a lot of books. And so then the question would be like, okay, so do they have libraries? What do those look like? Is it still built up? Like, do they have buildings, or are they more like traditional orcs in that maybe they don't have a lot of infrastructure, but they maybe like bury all their books? What does it look like? And you keep asking questions and try to fill out that detail. And like, oh yeah, they different orc scholars or leaders write these books and then they hide them away, and certain areas of the forest are protected. What do orcish books look like? What are in them? What's so important? Why are they writing them down? And you just keep asking questions and you kind of fill that out, that initial space. So that's where I begin. Take the kind of the dominant race and ask, what is known about them and something that is not stereotypical. The next one I'll go into is I'll ask about, a specific aspect of the common experience for all sentient kind. Maybe it's something about birth rituals, maybe it's about funeral rites, about marriage, schooling, becoming an adult, holidays, whatever it is, something that's kind of common across that. And I ask how, take one of them and like, how is it different for this group? So maybe I'll ask, okay, for these orcs in the forest, what does schooling look like for them? I try to pitch it away from what we just talked about. So I guess if it's books, maybe I wouldn't ask about schooling, but maybe I'll ask about what does birth look like for what would be like an interesting little thing from their culture about birth, and try to be creative. Like what would be a good idea for like, don't think of the books, don't think of orcs. What would be an interesting idea about birth that would be unique and special?
No child is raised with a family. They all get swapped.
They all they don't actually stay with you. They so would they, spend any time with the main family, or do they are they immediately sent off?
You get put in the pile and you take a new one out.
Maybe. Oh, it's like a lottery system. Kind of like maybe something determined by, the orcish gods that you're all a community. So, you have to raise them together. So, okay, you have these orcs that are raised by each other. And it also might help, like to me, that also tweaks, like if there's like, say, some problematic parents, you might weed them out, right? Like that would be a thing that might happen.
Will you destroy those familial bonds that end up causing problems and saying, no, I'm loyal to my family. No, you're loyal to everyone because you have no idea who your parents are and you don't know who your kid is. So,
oh man, the idea that it's a secret. Is it always a secret? Maybe here's one of the things and this kind of relates to how you do this is try to start linking stuff, have that initial conversation. So maybe what some of the book cachets are include the true genealogy of everybody.
There you go.
Because one of the important things, especially if you come of age in a place like this where you don't know your parentage, it will be kind of important to know for genetic purposes. Like, oh, actually, this is my half sister. I better not, like whatever.
Iceland solved that with an app. So,
yeah, very important. Yeah. Apps could be different in orc culture. Maybe they have like little rocks that are imbued. Anyways.
I think there could be one figure, though, that's kind of like the religious figure that knows all the genealogies, too. That's the only one that knows.
Yeah. And of course, they would be the ones that would be probably one of the ones right in the books, and they keep track of it kind of. Yeah, keeping track of genealogies is an important part of their thing. Are they the leader? Is there other ones? What kind of structure is there? This is what I'm talking about. As you go through, as you add each of these steps that we're going through, you keep asking questions and trying to like, how do all these things intersect? Perhaps a part of it is asking about like, well, what in the history of this led to such a thing of mixing up the families? Maybe it was just like there were wars between different clans of orcs, and like, you know what, it might bring more peace if we don't know. And like after a particularly bad war, we brought them together and it's like, we like that. You can fill that in. So that's the second one. Kind of ask about a specific thing about a common experience and explore that. Third one is ask about what would be like either a standard rule or a faux pas in the culture. Like, and once again, try to make it so that it's not one of the things that have already been established. Try to like encourage your players. Okay, really throw it out there. That's away from all the things that we discussed so far. So like, what would be a faux pas maybe in this orcish culture?
How about wearing pants all the way down to your ankles?
You have to wear pants all the way down to your ankles.
Capris all the time, baby.
Yeah. These people, look, if I can't see your ankles, I can't trust you. Now, this actually piques my brain of like maybe one of the things that was in that previous war, maybe they had the head of the clan had like a big old knife holstered in by their ankle. And that's how they like killed one of the others. And it was a big thing to show that you can trust. You don't show, you show your ankles and your feet and everything like that. Maybe they don't wear shoes at all. Like that's the whole thing. It goes that far. So from that, if they're not allowed to wear shoes, what are other things that might come from that? Like, how would they deal with going through thorny patches? What's their kind of solution to that? Because normally, if you had shoes, if you had long pants, it wouldn't be an issue. But how does a culture deal with it? And you keep asking questions. You keep asking the questions. You tie it back into the other things. You keep those things in mind as you go. And after a while, when you fill out all of those things, you have this really complex, unique kind of culture. And the players are going to remember it because they help design it. And even if there's a player that doesn't say anything, at least they heard the discussion and it's painting stuff in their minds as well. So yeah, it's between those things that you would come up with the culture, and then you move over to the other biome. Maybe it's a group of islands. Maybe it's the mountain range. And you do that 2 or 3 times, and it's almost like a game in and of itself, right? Like say it's kind of a gamey element, and players can really latch onto that, and they can see this world. They can go from there with it.
And I really like just the fact that, it informs, if I'm playing in this game, it's informing so much about how I'm going to make my character, because now I can choose to be from one of those places or choose to have at least encountered one of them. And when you're creating the second and third cultures too, I really like that you can, think about how they interact with the first. Like it all starts to become its own world very naturally.
Absolutely.
And I've played with a DM that, handed me reading material to catch myself up on all of their lore and this world that they'd crafted. And that's all well and good. If that's your style, I mean, some DMs are in it for the world building. But as we've kind of established, this is a ton of fun. And I'll second that with, my players again. I actually ended up doing each one of these phases as an entire session. We did 2 to 3 hours per phase of what we're talking about. And they didn't want to stop. They loved it because this is the fun part. And I get that a lot of DMs find it the fun part too. But why not open that up to your players and let them have a crack at it as well?
Yeah, because the thing is, you are still ultimately the DM. You can veto things along the way. If you're like, no, I actually don't like that. I think it should go this way. That's perfectly fine. But at least they were there for the discussion, right? Like they tried to accept as much of it as you can. Because the other benefit, as I said, like one person coming up with all of those details by themselves might be really hard. But you're going to have, 3, 4, 5 brains thinking on this, and you'll be pitched stuff that you would never expect. And it's created 3 cultures in my current campaign that like everybody knows, everybody understands, and we all can picture it because we all did it. We all worked on it. So,
and another benefit that I'm just thinking about for me, like as Jordan, if I'm doing it this way, I think a lot more unique and weird ideas are going to come up because I wouldn't put the details we just talked about in a culture I created to bring to the table. Honestly, I think I'd just be too self-conscious to do it, to be like, yeah, they have a thing about ankles. How do you guys feel about that? But if it's like that,
it sounds weird coming from one individual and that's it.
Exactly.
Right.
So Jordan's got a thing for ankles. I got it.
Got it. There's a weird foot thing going on. Gotcha. No, but, and that's the thing. This is where, as you guys kind of said at the top of the episode, that I do improv. Part of that, yes, and like just like I try not to shoot down any ideas. Just like immediately like take the thing. What's the interesting nugget about it? Let's keep going with it. And yes, and yes, and yes, and build on it. And then you'll wind up with it. Like you're saying that by doing this method, you'll wind up with stuff that you never would imagine coming up with. Like one of the rules or one of the things that shows a higher status in one of my cultures, they live on the islands, right? And there's a lot of rain that comes through and it's a stormy place. If you are a part of the high society, one way that you try to show that is that you're never wet.
Oh,
if you're never wet, like if you're constantly dry, that really shows like, well, you're not like the silver miners that have to dive into the water to go get the silver. You're the upper echelon, or maybe the higher class people like wear special clothing or suits that like are water repellent, like you go from there. And I would have never have thought of any of that on my own. That was all my players. And that's way cooler than anything I could have come up simply by myself.
Absolutely. Well, phase 3 is the character creation piece. And I know that there are a lot of DMs, and I used to do this myself quite a bit, of just saying like, okay, everyone, here's the world. I've created the world. Now go build a character for that world. And since then, I've completely done a 180 on myself. I will never go back to that system again. I will always build collaboratively as a group. I know that a lot of folks have kind of gotten in tune with this way of building characters together with tools like, Jordan and I tend to use the Fiasco relationship builder. And if you do that to each one of your players by connecting them to just one other person at the table, now all of a sudden they don't have to be a part of the same group or story, something or other, but they all know each other and they all have some personal connection to one another throughout the remainder of the story.
Yeah, and that's fundamental. You need to have a reason that these people are together. And I really like that idea of you're continuing that tradition from like just the world building. Now you're also doing it to the characters. And because they built it all, maybe you discover, hey, maybe there was a war between these two groups here or whatever, or maybe even an outside group. And, these two nations came together to rebuff. And yeah, you could add more details about the world through that even.
Absolutely.
Totally. Yeah. The character creation can continue to flesh out the world. Is there anything else that you do, David, when you're in this phase, like creating characters at the table to get things off on the right foot?
The main thing is I try to do when I have my characters together, my players together, I want you to pitch to me how you are together. Now, hopefully, if you've talked about theme and inspirations and all that kind of stuff, you have at least some sort of pitch. Like maybe it's like, hey, you're a group of bounty hunters together. Make your characters from that and, bind them together that way. I try to let's figure out why the group is together almost before the characters, because that can guide your decisions a little bit. If you're supposed to be a military unit, that's different than if you're like at some sort of adventuring academy and you're recruits and going off to do whatever. Yeah. So I try to find a reason to bond them that they would be coming out as a group together and then release them to come up with their characters or fill in all those details.
I think I would even throw more into the hat with giving the players or having them come up with kind of that central, like picking one of the themes or one or two of the themes and just saying, okay, tell me how your characters are connected to those themes and those values. In this last bout of a session 0, we started with tell me what that commonality is, because we had kind of all discussed as a group that we were going to do some kind of like gangs in New York style game with the core theme of they are in a gang. And then I just simply turned it and I said, what's a core value of your gang? And they said equality and equitability within the gang. Okay, interesting. So there's no hierarchy. And with that, we immediately used another topic that we've talked about a lot in the past. We have a whole episode on four-corner opposition. And so with four-corner opposition, it's probably pretty counter, and I'm sure I'm going to make some DM skin crawl with this, but I simply said, make your villain.
Yeah.
Because so many times in the past, I've built what I thought was just the best villain in the world. And then the players said, we're not really interested in that person. We're going to go over here. Yeah. And now all of my plans have gone to shit. But what's really cool about four-corner opposition is you start with one corner of being the players. And in the second corner, you allow them to create their own villain by simply resisting that core trait. So they're running counter to that core value. And then you still, as a DM, have 2 more corners to flesh out some more villains that will still surprise your players. But now at least the adventure is kicked off with all of them saying, we all hate that guy because we came up with them. And we know that we're supposed to. We don't have to be sold on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you're having the equity kind of thing as the core traits, and like if the villain is like, well, maybe it's a hard established system that we category mains everything to the villain. Yeah, and then you have the 2 offshoots. Because if I can remember correctly, because I remember this episode, I do listen to the podcast. You would have like 2 traits of the heroes, and then the one in the opposite corner would be what are the opposite of those 2 things. So you're saying once you have those 2 opposite traits, try to fill in what that main villain, or like the group that's around that villain, what does that look like? And the 2 corners are like they share a trait with the villain and the heroes and all that kind of stuff. I mean, right?
It's a very common storytelling tool, but I don't think it's really made the jump into tabletop role playing.
Yeah.
And to me, it was a total game changer of being able to flesh out an entire campaign with 3 separate villains, some that the players could see kinship with, to make that villain more relatable and more believable. I respect the hell out of them for this, but also they gotta die because of this. And being able to do that and then create their ultimate villain, which is completely counter to everything that they stand for. That's how to sell. And my campaign nearly wrote itself.
Yeah, it's nice to have more than just the one group that you're opposed to, that binary of like, we're on the good guy side and they're on the bad guy side. It's not, there's not a lot of life in that. But like even adding a third or the fourth group that can influence these events, that I think definitely enriches things and adds a lot of color to it. There might be a scenario where you're making an uneasy alliance to do this thing, and it adds a lot of depth to the world without being too much, because for me, the big problem coming up with the world is like, well, it's not like there's just like the bad guys and the good guys, but am I going to make every single nation in the world? Am I going to come up with every single, no, like, don't worry, just make it simple is been a big helpful piece of advice in general. You don't have to get too caught up. You don't have to plan to the end. You can just kind of plan in the immediate. And if you have like these 4 groups, how can you use the 4 groups? I think that's really good.
Yeah, talk about the most paralyzing thought as a new DM is just like, how far down do I go? Do I have to outline every NPC in this world and their desires and dreams and wants and fears? I can't do this.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually was a big thing for me when I was, for most of my DM career, I suppose, is like I would have to have everything figured out, every kind of like major thing in each village. And it became so daunting and I couldn't do it anyways. So it was just like, and I would just feel like a bad dungeon master because I couldn't figure it all out. But if it's just, hey, they come to the town here, let's figure out what would be a good scenario for this space. Maybe you didn't think about this town before walking into it. But Dungeons and Dragons, I've found over the years, doesn't move as fast as you think it does. So it's like, even by throwing a quick encounter with some raiders, you can slow things down. It's like, okay, they're going to go into this next village. What does it look like? What's the conflict? How can I use these 3 different groups? Can I highlight a thing in there? Yeah, it's much easier to have just go step by step.
Absolutely. And I think you touched on something that I almost feel like is an excellent end to this whole series of phases, which is, being a DM is tough enough. There's no reason to put more on yourself of having to try to craft an entire world on your own. Then you got session prep. Then you got all of the, like, if you're going the extra mile, then you're tying in themes and other characters' backstories. And like, there's more than enough to do. Share the load with the rest of the players at the table, because they got some creative shit that is just boiling up, and it's going to come out. You might as well harness it, leverage it, use it, and let them buy in.
Yeah, you can use it going forward. It doesn't have to just be at the start of the campaign. One of the things I found was a great boon was this idea of, maybe you're going into a pub and it's, you don't know, you just kind of like throwing it out there like, oh, there's this group, you see these dwarves over here, this gnome bard over there, and the human bartender. And the thing is, you may have only planned for like the gnomish bard to be of any significance. That's their contact or whatever, and you're just waiting for their set to finish up. But then they go talk to that table of dwarves, and you're like, I don't really have names for them. And so the players will go over maybe thinking that the dwarves have something important to say. And you ask, they ask, oh, so what are your names? Rick, Gimlo, and Rick too. Like, okay, so these people are not important. I'm going to stop investing in them. What I'll sometimes do, and especially in these scenarios where they walk in, I wouldn't do it for every single NPC in a place, but for a couple of them, maybe I'll get them to paint what those dwarves look like. Tell me what they kind of look like. Maybe give me 3 names. Now, secretly, when you use one of those dwarves later, because you have a great idea of like, oh, one of them saw what happened in the bar later on. Guess what? You can bring up that dwarf to be important. And because they named them, it's just like, oh, they don't know who's important and who's not, just like in the real world. When you walk up, you don't know how important any given person is. And by letting your players name folks or describing them, it gives the world a little bit more of its own vibrancy to a certain degree, its own like thing. Because there's a lot of characters. There's even major characters I didn't even name because I was like, they're going to encounter them in this, low stakes place, and they're going to turn out to be something major later. So I didn't name them, and they wound up naming them, and then they showed up later and they're surprised. Now, of course, if you've decided your major villain is Gormalax, and Gormalax is going to be in town, we go ahead and name him. Like, you don't have to do that for everybody, but there's certain scenarios where it's okay. Let them be a part of the process, and it will add mystery to this world of like, was the bartender important? Was the dwarves important in the bar? It adds a lot more vibrancy.
And
Absolutely.
reduces the number of Ricks in the world.
Just too many Ricks.
Yeah, 'cause there's way too many Ricks. My name list is 3 long. So
Pretty
Absolutely.
much.
Let's move on to our next segment and talk a little bit more about you and what you got going on.
This is the hero stage, where fantastic folk have a spotlight turned to them to tell the tales of their adventurous lives.
Well, David, Travis and I know, and I mean, the listeners know a little bit that we listed at the top, but you've done a lot of creative projects and you continue to bring new performances into the world. I only wish I could be in Edmonton for more of them, but what started you down this wild creative path that you're on?
I like performing. I enjoy doing comedy. And for the longest time, I would write sketches for, like, say, youth groups and summer camps that I worked at and stuff like that. And I'm like, I want to continue to do that. And when I moved to Edmonton, it's hard to just do sketch comedy when you know 0 people.
Sure.
So you're missing a vital component, which is others. So I decided, I liked the idea of stand-up comedy. I wanted to give that a shot. I was kind of inspired by Pete Holmes. He's a stand-up comedian, and his advice is, with stand-up, just know that you're going to suck for 2 years, and then over those 2 years, you're going to figure out your voice. And that was true. I just allowed because I always had that idea of I don't want to suck ever. But if I know that that's a part of the process, then it allowed myself to when those hard nights came and nobody laughed as I'm trying to figure out stand-up comedy, that it allowed me to push through. And eventually I just, connected in with the rest of the comedy community. One comedian in particular, Liam Creswick, he was like, well, hey, Dave, you know a lot about Dungeons and Dragons. You should try out for this improv group. And I had never done improv before, but I knew D&D, and I'm gangly and I can do weird tricks with my body. So I was able to somehow squeak through on the audition, and I started doing that. And Liam was then like, I want to do sketch comedy. And he gathered some people together. He asked me to join because he knew I did that. And I embraced all of these different paths because I wanted to try to learn from all of these different things to maybe help myself become a better writer, become a better comedian, become a better actor or whatever. And that is true. And of course, one of the things I did not expect is that it actually helped me play D&D better too. I've taken so much from improv, and it's helped me be a better DM and kind of relax at the table and go with the flow a little bit, and kind of realize that you can kind of take these things, these ideas from other people, and use them to your advantage to make a better story. So I think it came from an idea of I just like performing. I like making people laugh. If I can do it in sketch, if I can do it in stand-up, if I can do it, then great. That's what I want to do. And that led me through this. And I happen to have enough skill in all of them to be welcomed in all of those spaces.
But like you said, it probably took a little sucking to get there.
Yeah, there was learning improv it's not easy like what people think it is. There is things you need to learn. But, I had support, and the fact that I could just pull out the idea of what a manticore is in a D&D show, and people are like, oh.
Absolutely. Now, I'd love to hear a little bit more about, live action D&D role play. That is becoming a thing. It's fast becoming, a legitimate, hey, this is how D&D is played.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I know you had Lena Anderson on in a previous episode, who's also a part of the Debutantes and who also does Quantum Kickflip with me. And it's got like its own history. Like we do what's called YEG D&D, and YEG is like the airport code for Edmonton, but it's this D&D show that we do here. But it started in Winnipeg, as far as I can tell. The Winnipeg, there's a group of people in Winnipeg that do D&D for their fringe show, and it just kind of spread around. And to do it as a theater show, it's not the same as LARPing, which is its own kind of thing. It really is stripping down D&D to its basics of, classes and races and monsters and magic items, just like taking some of those references and making improvised stories based off of it, but kind of doing away with a lot of the rules. And how we resolve it is just like with simple D20 rolls. We don't have like character sheets or anything like that. It's just we'll hand the dice off to the audience to roll on our behalf. We look at the roll and decide, how well or poorly we did based on like if the numbers are really close, we just barely won or we barely lost. If there's a huge difference, then it's like, okay, this is a significant win or a significant loss, and we can't really communicate it, but we decide that we kind of like play it out and see what that looks like. And that has helped me with Dungeons and Dragons when it's like, what do these roles mean sometimes? Does a low roll mean that it's abysmal failure? And what does that look like for any given character? I do have to point out, I'm going to take it a side thing, your episode, or you talked about at one point the idea of like rolling ones for characters who are skilled in something. I think that was fundamental. That's such an important one of like, just because you rolled a 1 doesn't mean you look like an idiot necessarily. It just means, hey, it didn't work out the way you wanted. Yeah. But all of that came through that show, and
I think it's incredibly important to kind of take that lesson. I think as far as Jordan and I's DMing style, and both of us have significantly different styles. That being said, the journey of this podcast and the journey of just becoming a better DM, I would say is a lot of just learning to do exactly what you do in those kind of scenarios. And I'm sure even on Quantum Kickflip, of just distilling it down to what is fun, what story, let's keep it moving. Let's keep having fun, because we don't need to arbitrate. I know that there's 8,000 books out there with different rules, but ultimately this is a group storytelling experience. We're gonna keep things going, and we're gonna have fun with it.
What I like about that too is that like that's how I explain D&D to people that are new to it. Is how you explained what you do at your show. It's like, essentially, it's just a 20-sided dice, and however well you roll is however well you do, and we'll figure it out from there.
Yeah, well, and that's a key thing. And I think 5th edition does a really good job with that of, ultimately, it is the dungeon master who decides. Mm-hmm. And I think it's more important than getting caught up on the specific, the minutia of it. Instead, like, what's a better story with this failure? And yeah, I like how 5th edition has handled skills, and, that's a little bit more vague. And so like you can decide like that was a decent roll, and I think this is how it would look like. The fact that I don't have to always pull out a book and I can just like, well, 15's a decent number. Like I know that it's a lot easier to negotiate and to figure out.
Yeah. Well, all that experience kind of led you to one of your newest projects, which is Quantum Kickflip. Mm-hmm. So can you give us a bit of an overview of that fabulous podcast you're working on?
Yeah, it's actually an actual play podcast based on an upcoming tabletop role-playing game called Slug Blaster. It's being developed by somebody in Edmonton. His name's Mikey Ham. And the game is like lighter rules than D&D, but the premise is teenagers that will go to other dimensions. They have these devices that allow them to go to other dimensions, and they are just trying to become popular. Kind of like, think of skateboarders in the 90s that would go and like do all these tricks and make videos based on it. And then people are like, oh, that's amazing. And they become popular. In the same way, just do that, but in dimensions where, you know, suddenly vampires are real, or in a dimension where it's just all underwater. It's that kind of thing with teenagers with special equipment, pulling pranks or doing shenanigans, and then trying to become popular on social media or whatever. And in the case of Quantum Kickflip, it's set in small town Alberta with these kids that, you know, it's set in the 90s. That was thing that we decided to go with, 90s technology. And also we're, you know, 30-year-olds. So we know 90s references better than trying to pull out like
don't try and be
2010s.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it doesn't work. We're just going to say that we had the ability to go to other dimensions in the 90s, and then cool, I can make GoldenEye references. Perfect. But yeah, it's them just trying to make it and become popular.
I love the idea of the dimension hopping, because that is like creativity turned up to 11. You've got maximum potential with every next session or what have you to basically do exactly what we talked about earlier on in this show about, you know, place and time and theme. And like, you basically would do a mini session 0 to be, we're in a new dimension and vampires are real, but also they're super chill, and you know, they drive around spaceships. Like, what? And that's now the next session. Yeah, it's a very lighthearted kind of a game, Slug Blaster is. Like, even to the point where there's technically, your character can't die. This is not we're not doing a Game of Thrones in other dimensions. It's more like you can lose your character still, but your character would be, you know, maybe it's just too much for them and then they quit. And there's rules and how that kind of looks like, but it's not. It's supposed to be an upbeat, fun kind of story, and Mikey has really designed that game well for that, for sure.
Well, I think that's super cool how, you know, you change the stakes and it has that much of an effect. Like, you change the stakes from dying to being cool, and that informs so much of how you're going to play the game. And I also just love, like, when I started changing my DM style a bit to reflect everything we talked about in this episode, I think is about the time that I heard about Slug Blaster. And I was just thinking, that's what this is. This is just a mishmash of some amazing inspirations to make a totally unique gaming experience.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite things about Slug Blaster and how it's affected how I've done Dungeons and Dragons, like the core mechanic there, as opposed to D&D that rolls D20, you add a modifier, you discover it. In this, it's D6 based, and on a 1 to 3, you fail. On a 4 to 5, it's a mixed success. So like, you do what you're going to do, but there's a complication or a problem. And a 6 is an unequivocal success. And you'll notice that 5 of the numbers out of 6 have some sort of negative quality to it. And it's what I've learned from playing the game is that negative things can add to the story. It doesn't always have to be the worst things possible. Maybe you do sort of what you wanted, but not quite, or it causes this problem over here. Maybe you take a hit, or maybe you've caused this thing to explode that you didn't want to explode, or, you know, you do it that way. That it allowed me to be more creative with failures that I've incorporated over to D&D, where I've tried to justify failures in D&D better, where it's, you know, if your stealth check failed and you're proficient at it, I try to make it so it's like, yeah, it's not that you looked like a goof and crashed into a table and made a loud noise. Maybe it's just simply you had the unfortunate thing of the person looked over at the precise moment you were going. Like, it doesn't have to be world ending or like so like hard. It doesn't have to be the end of it. You can use it to expand and add more to it.
Well, it's the mechanic of of no but.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, and no but.
No, but yeah, if you can add to it, that's even better. Like the idea of, like here's a classic one. If you're doing a climb, like you're doing an athletics check to climb a thing, and now you could say you rolled, maybe an 11, but really a 15 is what you're looking for to succeed. Maybe on 11, you know what? You still did climb. You don't have to roll again. Problem is, maybe the monster will be waiting for you up at the top already. Like you don't have to no, I'm waiting for that 15 to show up on that die. Like you keep things advancing. What's the better story? And that's a big thing I took from Slug Blaster.
Well, if I'm a discerning podcast consumer and I have limited time to listen to all of the wonderful podcasts out there, why should I take my precious evening and spend it with all you yahoos over at Quantum Kickflip?
That's a good question. That's a thing when look, I don't know if you notice this, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And that shut the debutantes down from being able to perform. And we were like, well, what can we do to still, perform, try to keep our comedic sensibility sharp? And we were like debating podcasts. But the problem is we're like, look, there's a billion podcasts out there about every topic. And, even doing an actual play Dungeons and Dragons podcast, there's a million of those. And because we had, kind of tossed around the idea, and we're like, well, that doesn't stand out. But when we got the opportunity to play test this game and we loved it so much, it was so much fun. And we realized, hey, no one's really played this game yet. This is a thing that's upcoming. So the thing that makes ours unique is that you get to see this game played specifically. You get to see how the game kind of works. We've also, I think it's very charming and funny. And we have a ton of fun throughout all of it. It's a lighthearted podcast. And if you want to see improvisers working at their best, I think Quantum Kickflip is a good choice.
Well, 100% back that, because yes, the show is tremendously fun to listen to. It's totally out there. It's totally zany. And just the fact that, it is a whole bunch of consummate performers that are just, you guys capture attention and you hold it in an iron grip, and it's just a tremendous listen. It's a lot of fun.
Which to me is the big difference between you guys and many of the million that you mentioned is, you guys have experience with all of the elements that make an actual play podcast. So it's a quality piece of work to start with.
Thank you. That means a lot. We try to be heartwarming and funny at the same time, and also very silly. I'm a big fan of wrestling and the way Slug Blaster works. You can totally say, I'm going to do a German suplex off of the top of this balcony. And you don't need to have a special feat to do that. You can just describe that. So the game is very open to be able to add your own zest to it, which, by the way, you should check out Slug Blaster as well. That's a side thing. I'm not really involved with it, but I think you should check that game out.
Absolutely.
Too.
And can you quickly just tell us who you play in Quantum Kickflip?
Oh, absolutely. So I play Chester Capone. He is from Philadelphia, and he moves to this small town in Alberta. I have my class. It's called a playbook in that game. It is called The Grit. And the Grit playbook is supposed to be just a tough son of a gun. They can take hits and they keep going. So I'm totally one of those ones that I'm not necessarily good at fighting. It's just that I can take a lot of punches to the face kind of a thing, and I can just keep going. And he's kind of like a himbo. He's just he's a nice guy, and he's tough, but you know what? He's a sweetheart. And he loves Philadelphia. He's kind of dumb, but...
And so you have to check him out for the quotes that he gives from his family?
Yes, from Graham Capone, which is me just making up bits of wisdom. Stuff like, if you have to kiss the tax man, don't slip him tongue. What does that mean? Who knows? But that's the kind of weird folksy wisdom that he gets from his grandma. That's his morals compass kind of a thing. And he's a little bit dopey, but it's so much fun to play a dopey guy who can like still fight real good, you know?
Well, I think your character's fake Graham and our real Graham have been talking, because I'm pretty sure she gave us the same advice. Well, we'll have all of the links to you, David, and also, of course, to Quantum Kickflip. So we'll have those in the show notes. But
if you need to quickly check them out, you've got quantumkickflip.com, or you can follow David in a lot of places. But if you need to get a hold of him right now before you check the show notes, you just find him on Twitter at the Dave Ray, or on TikTok, where he's got some D&D content, if I'm not mistaken, at Mr. David Ray.
Yeah, I don't have like a ton of videos on there, but there are a few like little pieces of D&D that I like to share on there. You know, I've been doing this for, I guess, 26 years now, and I don't pretend I'm the best DM, but I've done it enough and failed enough to have some ideas. So,
well, again, that's at Quantum Kickflip, Twitter, Facebook, all of those places, and then the Dave Ray on Twitter, right on.
Mr. David Ray on TikTok.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's wonderful to finally get you on the show. And thanks for sharing all of those wonderful nuggets of wisdom with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Also, big thanks to all of our patrons, the wonderful folks that keep this podcast going. Thanks to Stephen Van C.,
Alan E.,
Matthew T.,
Felix R.,
Chris F.,
The Senate,
Lucas D.,
Lila G.,
the GM Tim,
Nevermore,
Thomas W.,
Tyler G.,
Ty N.,
Heavy Arms,
Eric R.,
Aldrost,
Leprechaun,
and Will HP.
Thanks also to Tabletop Audio for the sound effects you heard in this episode.
You can find us at any of the social medias at Hook and Chance.
And you can join our community of DMs and players who give great advice, just like the stuff that you heard on this episode, in our Discord.
And David, if you'd like to join us, it doesn't have to be good or correct. Just do it in 3, 2, 1. Thanks for listening. And play great
Garms. Oh, no.
Perfect.
Wait, Garms is not how you say that.